Hello and welcome to episode 13 of the Keyboard Chronicles, a podcast for keyboard players of the gigging variety. I'm your host David Holloway and it's brilliant as always to be here with you. My guest this episode is Darren Heinrich, who's based in Sydney, Australia. Darren is a jazz organist and plays extensively in the Sydney area, obviously around jazz as an organist. What makes him even more unique in some respects is that he holds a PhD in Jazz Organ Improvisation. So I could think of no one better to educate me, at least, on some of the finer points of jazz. But as you'll hear, Darren has some interesting insights on playing, his upbringing and his approach to jazz and music more widely. So I hope you enjoy it. Darren, thanks heaps for joining us.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here.
It's really nice to talk to someone in the same time zone, I find. I've loved talking to some of our US compatriots and European compatriots, but yeah, nice to be on the same continent at least.
I just remembered the other day how, when I was 18 and interested in some rare piece of gear, I'd have to stay up all night to call California about whatever. And the whole time zone thing has changed a lot since the internet came along.
Oh, yes. Thank God for the internet, particularly now. And that's probably a good segue. How we've been asking the last few guests, how are you finding the whole relative lockdown thing? Are you keeping busy?
I am keeping busy. It's a little bit hard to remain focused, I think, but I've managed to, write a couple of tracks and explore things in my studio that I might not have normally got around to doing. So it's good. And the sort of 6 hours or so teaching I do a week has moved online. So I don't have to go anywhere, which
that's right. Oh, that's good. And so, well, let's start off with the potted history of Darren Heinrich. So, tell us a little bit about your early days, what got you into music and where you're at now.
Well, my mum played piano a little bit, and there was an old German upright in the house, and I was packed off to piano lessons when I was about 7, I guess. Okay. And like my mum was a big rock and roll fan, so we were always listening to the Beatles and, some of my very, very earliest memories are sort of putting on cassettes of the Beatles and with my brothers and singing along and acting like we were the Beatles and all of that sort of thing. But it's funny, as a young man, like at school, I mean, I was into lots of things, BMX racing and like an 80s kid and playing both rugby league and rugby union. And it wasn't until I changed to a school that had a proper music program I went, oh, wow, I want to be a part of that. So, yeah, I guess that's where I started to get a bit more serious about it.
Yeah. Okay. So that was around high school level you changed schools?
Yeah.
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 And what was it about the program specifically? Was just the comprehensiveness of it, or just like what made you confirm that, piano and obviously more recently organ is the instrument that you wanted to work on?
Well, I think, in those days it was sort of mid-'80s and I'd had a synthesizer Tangerine Dream sort of band with a friend at one high school. And, my first synthesizer was a Korg MS-10, which, when I think about it now, it sounded dreadful unless you put it through a ton of guitar pedals. But we made it work. But then when I changed high schools, it was, there was people there who were playing all sorts of instruments in a rock band format, and I'm like, oh wow, that was. I thought, yeah, that's exactly what I want to do. But the classical piano thing didn't really make for an easy transition into that.
So was and for our listeners' sake, obviously your specialty now is well and truly jazz. What got you, was jazz the transition between, say, that more classical piano approach and maybe rock not being the desired outcome for your career?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I was playing in sort of cover bands and things like that in the late 80s and sort of dabbling a little bit in jazz, but not really having an entry point in terms of anybody around me really being that into jazz or that knowledgeable. And then a friend of mine who was still a bass player, and he was taking some classes at the conservatorium, and he played for me on the bass a couple of Charlie Parker heads. And I went, oh, wow, I want to do that. That's what, it was like, I mean, it sounds corny, but that was a bit of a light bulb moment. It's like, I don't know what that is, but I want to do it. So, and then I sort of set about, trying to find out how to do that.
Yeah. And so how did you do that?
Well, it was more trial and error, lots of error. And I, with the benefit of hindsight, I think it's, trying to learn the musical language of jazz in another country. I mean, yes, people do it all the time and it seems mundane, but it's actually not that easy a process depending on your environment. Whereas, I mean, if you grew up in Chicago or New York or New Orleans, you'd sort of be a lot more exposed to that. Even with the sort of the musical culture that goes along with that. But yeah, I started taking lessons from Alistair Spence, and then I had lessons from the great Paul McNamara, who's just an incredible teacher. And a lot of my teaching methods, I guess, I use his methods because they work. So, yeah, I don't think if it wasn't for Paul McNamara, I don't know whether I'd be still playing, like he came along at the right time to, especially as the business was changing, I feel like I've constantly had to upskill just to stay on the treadmill, so to speak. And if it wasn't for him, I don't think that I'd still be playing. And he's still around, sort of semi-retired, but just a wonderful human being and musician.
Okay. And I want to get onto the business side and staying afloat in a little while, but you just made a great point about learning the language coming from outside of the US. So do you want to go a little bit into what did you find challenging about learning jazz initially, and what have you come to realise about the unique nature of jazz and the US origin of it, like how that is easier if you're based in the US?
Well, I think, like looking back at my sort of suburban Sydney childhood, there wasn't a lot of that around. Like you couldn't walk down past a corner cafe and hear people playing, or, it was a rare thing to growing up in suburban Sydney to hear live jazz. And after some time, even we had a family friend who he'd been a professional drummer, but then he ended up with a day job, but he was playing at a pretty high level. And I remember going to see that band a few times and going, wow, like this is amazing. And I said to him, John, can you ask the piano player, can he teach me? And like he just said, oh, he doesn't want to teach. Like there were so many gigs in those days that, those guys, just wanted to sleep in all day because they'd be doing 2 gigs the next. And they, so it was even asking around and trying to find somebody to teach you who was willing to teach you was, impossible. And my, the little old lady that I had piano lessons down the road, it was fine for the classical thing, but, I don't think she'd ever really done a gig in her life. So, that was hard. And I think the language thing, I mean, it's exactly like trying to learn to speak Spanish if you haven't really been around Spanish people a lot. It's exactly the same. And then you've got the whole interface of which instrument are you going to express this language on. So I was very much a late bloomer like that. I have a very analytical mind, so I'm sort of person who would really feel the need to understand something deeply before I'd feel confident using it, if you know what I mean. That's,
Yeah.
so that's kind of, I hope that answers the question, but
Yeah,
it's,
yeah. No, it does, and so you're right. And for listeners outside of Australia, obviously we're a smaller country, and jazz in most societies, including the US, still being a smaller proportion of musicians than say your normal rock pop. I don't know about classical, Darren. Would there be more? There'd be more jazz musicians, particularly in the US, than classical musicians. I'm not so sure that's the case in Australia, but you're right. It's just having access to those people, and I can only imagine how few people there are coming from country areas that are doing jazz. Actually, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. Are you seeing people from outside the metro areas actively involved in the jazz scene?
Yes, but well, when I think about, I mean, there's a few people, like Toby Hall, who was from Bathurst. He's a drummer, amazing jazz drummer, and but not that I can think of. Like there tends to be. I mean, when I was an undergrad at Sydney Con, I remember the director saying something about, most of our students are, from rich North Shore families. And when I think of outside of Sydney, Canberra comes to mind, but Canberra's a major city full of, lots of educated people push their kids in those directions anyway.
I think the rest of us country kids end up as cover band musicians, Darren. So you got out of that. I'm still there. I'm still enjoying it, but I'm still there. Yeah, so no, I think that's a really valid point. And so you mentioned also before about, staying afloat and needing to evolve and adjust. So how have you managed that over the years as far as what's kept it going for you, if not financially brilliant for you, at least what's kept you in the scene?
Wow. Well, in terms of skills, I don't know. Look, sometimes people sit down and make these grand plans and work the plan. You know what I mean? Like and adjust as they go along. And I guess I always wanted to do it. And at certain points, it's not like I've had any sort of epiphany, but I just thought, I need to learn about that, or I want to learn about that, or, some combination of the two. And it just seems to be maybe more luck than design, but I've managed to upskill at the right time. Like, for example, I can remember being quite a young keyboard player and starting to get booked for casual gigs. And I'd always been in bands that rehearsed there till they were blue in the face. Mm. And the whole idea of turning up to a gig where you don't know the music was kind of terrifying. But I'd had that demonstrated to me fairly early on, so I knew it was possible. So I was thinking, well, how do I get the skills so I can do that? But in terms of the organ thing, like that was I'd always been interested. About 1990, I went to the US for the first time, and a friend of mine said, because CDs were so much cheaper in the States in those days, and so I went and brought back a suitcase full, literally. And a friend of mine said, you should get this album by Jimmy Smith called Crazy Baby, and that's still probably my favorite album of all albums that I own. And I remember listening to it going, wow, he's doing all the bass and all those chords and all that soloing all by himself. And then I always been interested in organ because the sound just appealed to me. Even like I can remember as a kid back in the 70s hearing some little texture in the back of a rock record or something like that, and not knowing, but kind of, in the back of my mind thinking, that must be an organ because it's not a piano. And but then never being able to find one here because there's such a rare, a Hammond B3 or C3 and a Leslie speaker is actually hard to come by in Australia. And I've spent lots of time trying to find my own. But then the clones came out, so I had this very part-time interest in building websites, and I ended up building a website for Tarahumara Music, and part of my payment for that was a Korg CX3 clone organ.
Oh, that's a good one.
So and then I got that in about, say, the November, and then a friend of mine said, "Hey, I got these gigs in January. Do you want to do them on organ?" So it was like a huge sort of scramble to learn 20 songs that I could cut a bass line to, and then at the same time the gig scene started to shrink and budgets shrank, and it was like, oh well, if we hire Darren, we can get a bass player and a keyboard player.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean. Like, I think I was lucky like that, and at that stage in Sydney, I don't think anybody else was doing the jazz organ thing. Yeah, I mean, maybe, but there's people around, but not necessarily active, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. And so that interest in the jazz organ even led to you, well, not only starting but completing a PhD in jazz organ improvisation. So a couple of questions on this. We'd obviously love to hear the process for you in achieving that, but also you've obviously managed to maintain your passion for the organ after doing a PhD, which can sometimes be a challenge. Some people lose all interest in their topic after spending so many years at that high level of education. So, yeah, tell us about what got you into that level of study and how you've maintained your interest.
Well, when I did my degree in jazz piano very much as a mature age student. And, so I guess that's sort of further evidence of being a late bloomer. But during that process, like we'd play at concert practice, and I ended up sort of playing at concert practice, which is pretty intimidating for me. It's like all of your peers and all the teachers knew and saying, hey, that was good or that wasn't good and here's why. But, so I managed to incorporate organ into that undergraduate thing and did a little honours paper and recital based upon that. But then many years later, maybe 10 years later, there was all these things that I wanted to study about the organ, and I wanted to find the time to, I wanted to find the time to do it, and I sort of needed to justify it in terms of trying to get the maximum out of putting in all that effort. And I just thought, well, if I do a PhD, I can study all the things that I want to study but I'll just be doing it formally, and I'll get a qualification at the end of it. So, and then I was lucky enough to get an APA scholarship. So I basically got paid to do it. So, there's no complaints from me there. And look, it's easy to make a musician complain. It's like, that old joke, but even I can't think of anything negative about the whole process. I just loved it from even the hard stuff. I loved from beginning to end. So I was very, very lucky to get to do that.
Yeah. And so for those, there'll be a lot of our listeners that do understand what a PhD involves, but some don't. Just give a little bit of an overview of what the hurdles you need to jump to finally get that qualification.
Well, I guess the first thing is you've got to show a need to do the research. Like, if you were wanting to do a PhD on John Coltrane, I reckon that territory's well, I'm sure somebody can always find something new to say, but a lot's already been said, so the cracks in the knowledge are not very wide, whereas nobody had done a PhD on jazz organ at that stage. And so it was easy for me to show a need for it. And then you've got to learn about how to research. There's some technical things to do with that. And then, I didn't want to do this PhD if it wasn't going to improve my playing. And so I made it basically, a method for me to find a way to practice all the language that I wanted to practice and improve upon. And look, I probably touched about 20% of the things that I wanted to, but there was a point where my supervisor said, "Oh, you'll have to stop transcribing now," But I basically transcribed a whole lot of Jimmy Smith stuff and found he had a vocabulary. And I was inspired by hearing about, I can't think of the researcher's name now, but somebody's done a PhD into Charlie Parker's improvisational vocabulary.
Okay.
And they found he had 70 phrases that he would use, mix and match, edit, extend, play in different keys, all of that, which is a lot. That's a big vocabulary. And so I remember the first big Jimmy Smith transcription I did. I transcribed, every chorus of his famous solo on the Champ, and then I, going through it, I found, oh, well, there's that phrase again, or there's a phrase that's a bit like that, but he's doing it in, so. And then I identified all this early vocabulary of some from his first recordings, which created such a stir on the New York jazz scene. And then I started to find a way to practice those in order to incorporate that vocabulary into my playing. So it's not really just learning a lick and then reproducing it. It's more language based than that.
And so I've had a faulty assumption too, because I'm sort of equating the PhD you've done with, say, a teacher or a historian or a nurse or whatever, doing that more academic, and this is obviously an academic exercise, but as far as writing a 100,000 word thesis with a method and a literature review and a conclusion. Now, there's obviously an aspect to that, I'm assuming, for yours, but was there also a performance aspect?
Yes, I submitted recordings that I did. I did some recordings of compositions. I recorded those in my home studio, which I was glad to get a good result from that. And so they're in the ebook version, and then there's some live recordings of myself and Sam Rollings and Andrew Dickerson at Lazy Bones. That was just a gig that got recorded and turned out well. And I thought, well, there's a good example, everything. And then I videoed some of my processes and of how I practice this stuff. And some of those are on my YouTube channel, Jazz Organ Bites, and then others are just in the ebook version of the paper.
Okay, which I'll track down, or I might get you to send me a link. But
yeah,
I know it'll be all on the databases. So yeah, that's great. Thank you for that, and we'll definitely be linking to the videos as well. So you achieved that qualification, which is an incredible feat. What's that done? Obviously, it's helped you, as you said, in developing your own playing. But has it assisted you more widely in the industry?
Well, look, it's a weird thing, it has. I mean, I got, it took a couple of years, but I got invited to start teaching it at the conservatorium, and I just finished teaching at another institution, so it was nice to pick up, another formal sort of teaching gig, and it's a very, very, very nice place to work, and the students are great. And in the industry, look, I don't know. Like my musician friends, they like to make a fuss of it sometimes on gigs, and but it's I guess the biggest thing is it's done, besides improve my playing, is just give me more confidence that I've kind of, if I'm honest, I've sort of lacked in confidence, most of my life. So it's a nice shot in the arm, and any time if I'm feeling less than what I should be, I go, oh, hang on a second, I did do that. That's right.
Yeah, exactly. You've contributed unique knowledge to the field of jazz. So yeah, it doesn't get much better than that. So no, that's great, and obviously you're still very actively playing. And you mentioned about the decline in gigs and stuff. So I mean, what is the local scene like compared to say 10 or 20 years ago?
Oh gosh, it's funny you mentioned that. I was, so much time on my hands at the moment with the whole pandemic thing, and I was going through some boxes and having a clean out, and I came across this diary from 1990. And and obviously in those days it is a paper diary, and I must have gone through at the end of that year and counted up all the gigs that I'd put in my diary, and in that year 1998 there was 200 gigs.
Wow.
Or at least actually there was maybe like 220 or something like that. There was a lot of playing, and yes, it was really interesting because when I think about it, I was probably I'm probably 10 times the musicians I was 20 years ago. There's like a tenth of the work, so it's I mean, and look, and part of that's getting older, and I will admit getting a little bit fussier about the kind of gigs that I do. But I am happy to say that I might do less gigs, but the ones that I do are of a sort of higher caliber, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you can't have it all.
No, that's right. And I mean, for our international listeners, there's some notable jazz musicians from Australia or other ones that you admire. And just as an aside, obviously I'm a total heathen in regards to jazz. I fully admit that. So my limit of musician knowledge in the Australian jazz scene doesn't go a lot beyond James Morrison and Don Burrows. And obviously I even had a bit of a tear in my eye with that Australian Story episode on Don Burrows passing away, and his it was great. So talk a little bit about the Australian scene. Some notable people. So for the jazz heads in our audience, they can go and check some of that out.
Well, I think I want to mention the great organist and pianist Col Nolan, who passed away about a year ago. Col was a true Australian pioneer of jazz, and his records that he made with his organ quartet are rare, and they fetch huge prices on eBay. And he was like the first Australian guy to do the traditional sort of Jimmy Smith stuff, left-hand bass and pedals and carting around the B3 and a Leslie speaker. And he was one of those completely natural musicians, here's another great example. I'd ask him to teach me, and he goes, "Oh, mate, I can't teach." I mean, so music for him was a very indifferent sort of, very natural, all ears kind of expression. And I owe him a great debt because he had a trio gig very close to my house. This is maybe 15 years ago. And as his health declined, I'd get these last-minute calls to come in. And I had sort of, less than probably 10 gigs under my belt at that stage on the organ. So it was one of those, looking back, it was one of those classic, thrown in the deep end during a torrential storm and having to sink or swim, and that taught me a lot. So Col's definitely worth checking out. I mean, he's famous for like soundtracks to the movie, like Picnic at Hanging Rock. In terms of just being Australian jazz royalty, he needs his praises sung. So yeah, check out Col.
That's a great one. And I'll be seeking out some of his stuff and linking to that. And just let's talk a little bit of gear, Darren. So obviously you mentioned the rarity of B3s, particularly when you're growing up in early adult years, and I can vouch for that. I only got to lay hands on my first one in my late 20s. What gear do you currently use regularly in gigs?
Well, on gigs, I have I've gone through a lot of different, clone organs. but I'm playing the Viscount Legend organ at the moment. And full disclosure, after owning those organs, or that company's organs, I sort of became the Australian distributor.
Okay.
But I mean, that's just like a hobby farm business for me. I might sell 2 a year if I'm lucky.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a great organ, and I was dragging around a Leslie speaker for it for a long time, and using that on most gigs. But then I managed to get sort of good regular amplification sorted out for it, so the Leslie stays at home, and the Leslie sim and that thing sounds wonderful. So
you just use standard amplification, but using the simulator or whatever.
Yeah.
And so that's your go-to piece. And then on the B3 or C3 side, so you've had the opportunity to play them over the years, obviously.
Yeah, I managed to get about 13 years ago. I managed to get my own Hammond, and for some reason, I get really lucky with Leslie's sort of coming my way, and I've got way too many Leslies. I mean, I got given one for free recently, and so I've got like 4 of them hanging around the place. But they're so, I had to find one for Sydney Conservatorium recently, like an organ and a Leslie, and I probably spent 2 weeks full time, ringing, emailing, turning over every rock I could possibly find. And I managed to find one, but it was ridiculously expensive.
Yeah.
But it's a good organ, so that's a good instrument to have in a university situation like that. That's kind of where it belongs. But yeah, and a lot of the organs that are in Australia are after, like, they were built by Hammond after 1963, so they can tend to have a lot of issues that are expensive to fix.
Yeah.
So you've got to be very careful here. Whereas if any city in the US, you could, if you needed an organ tonight, you could find one this up.
Right. Yeah. And do you recall, I've gone on about this in a previous episode, what a religious experience was playing a B3 for the first time, even in my own limited way. Do you remember the first time you actually laid hands on one?
I do. When I was in high school in year 11, I went to do, like, they have this work experience program, which I don't know whether the overseas schools have that, but it's basically letting kids out into the real world and have the adults boss them around. But I was lucky enough to go to ABC Studios, and the great Australian jazz band Galapagos Duck were cutting a record. So, I mean, that was an amazing situation and a very funny situation. But the pianist in that band, Bob Egger, he had to play Hammond organ on one track, and so very briefly I got to sit down and play it between takes, and I was just amazed at the sound. Yeah. And I was also amazed at the work ethic of Australian musicians of that generation, because I mean that studio in those days was in East Sydney, so at lunchtime it'd be instruments down and down the pub, and so the takes after lunch, there was always more takes after lunch that were all false starts and things like that. But yeah, it was people don't do that so much anymore, but I think, as the old joke goes, if you want to be able to play drunk, you got to practice drunk, and I think that might have been a thing for that generation.
See, there's a motto we could all live by. That's a really good one. So, and what are some of the biggest lessons? And I know this is a very broad question, particularly in the case of what you play, but what are some of the biggest lessons you've learnt as a keyboard player, organ player over the years in relation to gigging?
Well, I think it's to be ready. That's a very open sort of question, but I think, like, one of the things at the moment is, I'm sort of struggling at times to find the motivation to do technical practice, and I realize my hands aren't as strong what they would be if I was, because so many gigs are canned at the moment. But I'm still practicing, and there's a Beethoven piece that I love playing that's great for the hands, and that seems to be enough maintenance, but in terms of being ready, that's a really hard one. It's like, going back to Paul McNamara, one of the greatest things he ever taught me was, I was asking him, how do I play chords behind somebody who's soloing, because my first efforts in jazz, some of the horn players were pretty unkind. And he said to me, well, that's really hard, because he said it's like going down to the soccer field and you can run around in the mouth of the goal all you like, but until someone kicks the ball to you, then it's all academic, really. So I think, it's just trying to listen to as many records as you can, and at least have some idea. Like you can't be an expert or know every tune, but I think if you have a varied enough diet musically, then you can be ready for a lot of things. The other thing that I think I've learned recently, sort of having hit my 50th birthday, is that I've stopped trying to be all things to all people.
Yeah.
I think I, for a very long time, tried to be this guy and that guy. And, I guess in Sydney, I'm sort of known as the organ guy, and that's great. But I sort of wish I was still doing more jazz piano gigs, and I did a piano trio gig recently that was just a blast, and I haven't really done that format for so long. But it was just like, oh gosh, I've got to get back and do more of that. So,
and you raise a good point there. As far as I've purposely avoided even talking about the style of jazz you play, because I can imagine that's a fraught area. It can bog you down for hours, so that's why I've avoided that. But it's interesting you just mentioned even the piano versus organ stuff, as far as getting back and doing something a little different.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm mostly attracted to the fairly swinging, straight ahead kind of stuff. But I've also spent a fair bit of time working on sort of more, advanced harmony and modal concepts and things like that. But I wouldn't say I'm really a fusion person, or like I have, almost zero skills with bizarre time signatures like 11/8. Like I'm not really attracted to that music. And but if I am, if I come across a record that really switches the brain on, I'll be all over it like a rash. But until that happens, it would just be some sort of, I'd be playing it for the wrong reasons, I think.
And so you mentioned that you're doing some studio stuff, whatever. So, and I plead guilty on this, I haven't noticed you. Have you released your stuff under your own trio previously, or is that something you've got planned for the future? Or
well, I think I've got 3 trio records of organ music.
Great.
And one of those got a nice little award in Keyboard Magazine in the US. So that was,
that's right.
Yeah. And then I did have planned to record a duo album at home this year, but the whole pandemic thing has gotten in that. So yeah, I've started pre-production for it, but it's just going to be an album of guitar and organ, and I've got a lot of guitar player buddies, so I've got, they're all going to do probably 3 tracks each with me, and that's something I can record at home very easily, and get a good sound. And I mean, recording drums here is a little harder, but sure we can do it.
And that probably answers the question of what you've got coming up in the next year or so. So obviously teaching, but it sounds like you've got a bit of a project underway.
Yeah, that's underway, and I was supposed to go to Italy for some gigs in June, but that's completely cards. and it probably won't be on until the following northern summer. So that'd be nice. But yeah,
that's great. And just you mentioned about Italy. Any predictions? Not that any of us know you want to make on when we'll all be gigging again. I mean, Australia's a little bit different to some other countries, but I still can't see 2020 being a year that features any great live music. I think, pubs, clubs, performance venues will be some of the last things to reopen.
I do remember somebody saying, somebody in the know saying, the live music industry was the first to go, which I think is pretty true here in Australia.
Yeah.
And the same person, this person said, it's probably going to be the last thing to reopen, because I mean, in Australia, music's a luxury, and a lot of places aren't willing to pay what it's worth. I mean, so I think as pubs and clubs get started again, I think they'll be treading very carefully with their budgets. Having said that, I ideally hope that it's something like, World War II finishing and people going nuts partying. So
that's right. Yep, that's my prediction as well. Well, maybe hopeful, but that's what I'm hoping for as well.
I'm hoping for too. That'd be a lot of fun.
And us cover band musicians will probably have a bit of a renaissance for a few months.
Yeah. Well, there's nothing wrong with cover bands.
No.
I mean, not everybody is a great composer, and nor should they be.
No, that's right.
And it's interesting that because I grew up in that cover band scene in Sydney in the late 80s and early 90s that was so strong, there was just so much work for that kind of thing. And, when I was 18 years old, I was sort of doing, 5 gigs a week, summer, winter, didn't really matter, sometimes more than that. But, I mean, in jazz world, because the tradition is standards, I mean, you could look at those as covers, but we just play them our own way. So
that's right.
Yeah. If anybody's hung up on that, that's something you can definitely let go. There's just music, And
yeah, that's right.
If you like a song, and you're going to make somebody happy in the audience by them hearing that song, then
yeah, no, I agree. And speaking of covers, let's talk about album covers. The last question we ask every guest, Darren, is the dreaded Desert Island Discs question. So 5 albums you couldn't possibly live without.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, I mean, there's the Jimmy Smith Crazy Baby that I mentioned before.
Yep.
And then I still have my 1980 vinyl copy of AC/DC's Back in Black. So
good move, yeah.
And every time I put it on the other day as I was painting the house, and that's just like a perfect record, and it makes me want to play guitar, but then the learning curve kind of puts me off. Yeah. So there's 2, and then there'd be Brother Jack McDuff's live album, and I think the CD version of that is kind of a like a compilation of 2 live albums as well. And then there'd be my, let's see, I mean, there's so much to choose from, top 5, but there'd be Larry Young's Unity record in there. So how many have I got?
That's 4. You got 1 to go.
No, then I've got to have. I couldn't do without James Brown. So
there you go.
Can I sneak in the James Brown Star Time box set?
Yeah, absolutely. You're not the first to sneak in a box set.
And that'd probably keep me very happy. But I might need some Stevie Ray Vaughan in there as well. I don't know.
There you go. Yeah. And it's interesting, Back in Black, because you're right. That's a commonly cited one for very good reason. And I haven't looked for a while, but I think it's like the 3rd biggest selling album in history, that one.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting, because what has always appealed to me, even in times before I really knew, is besides the songs and the sound, like that band grooves like so hard, and that's the the African American influence in there. And I remember reading this interview with Malcolm Young, and somebody said to him, "What's the difference between rock music and rock and roll music?" And he said, "Well, rock and roll has a swing, and that comes out of all the blues stuff that him and Angus love so much." So it's it's that, I think that's what appeals to me about it the most. Phil Rudd's incredible pocket and the way, it's, I love it.
It's great. And Darren, look, thank you so much for that. And for the sake of our jazz playing and listening audience, I do apologise. I probably haven't been able to ask some questions some of our listeners would have loved, but I'll wait for that in the comments on the actual show. But yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. And I definitely need to try and get that whole 70 or 80 kilometres north to actually see you play once you're back into it.
Yeah, great. That'd be good.
And there's the interview. A huge thanks to Darren for taking part. I found that extremely illuminating, and I could certainly use a lot more education in regards to jazz, and that certainly has got me on the right road. Do check out our show notes, because we'll be linking to a lot of the information that Darren linked to as far as artists for some deeper listening. So yeah, I'm personally looking forward to that as well. So the Keyboard Chronicles will be back in a fortnight or so, but just a reminder that you can keep in touch via a few means. Our website is www.keyboardchronicles.com, and we're on Facebook at facebook.com/Keyboard Chronicles, and on Twitter at the Keyboard CHR1. We're always up for a good old-fashioned email, so do drop us a line at editor@keyboardchronicles.com. And most importantly, thanks to you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you back here in about a fortnight.